Hello and welcome to Week 8, Presentation 1, where we're going to define and articulate what situational crime prevention is. And one way to sort of think about what we're doing this week is it's the introduction of a new dawn, a new day, or what have you. And the reason for that is in the previous week we looked at crime prevention through environmental design, a very particular policy approach whereby one can, by designing the physical environment, lead to a reduction in overall crime in an area. Situational crime prevention, or in policing circles what is referred to as problem-oriented policing, takes many of the ideas of CPTED and the concepts that are infused throughout CPTED and takes it to a whole nother level, adds a whole methodology for how you approach solving a problem, and really uses some of the more advanced sort of approaches for how scientists research problems and applies it in a social setting. One point I want to make sure is clear, and I think this has probably come out in the recent presentations, but it bears repeating, and that is that while last week we were talking about crime prevention through environmental design, and this week we're talking about situational crime prevention, while their ultimate aim is essentially very similar, it's about reduction in crime, or eliminating crime, or controlling crime. This particular approach is really ideal for controlling any behaviors. I know I said that last week about crime prevention through environmental design, but situational crime prevention, I like to think of it as situational blank prevention. And in blank, take the word crime out and put any human behavior you can imagine in there, and you can apply the methodology for controlling or preventing those behaviors. I think that the validity of what I'm saying, which you can evaluate on your own, will become clearer as we move forward. The purpose of this particular presentation is to explain what situational crime prevention is and how is it a little different from different forms of policing. But again, whether you're into policing or not, or law enforcement, it's not nearly as important as terms of just understanding that those same techniques for policing that were in previous eras used to respond to crime are not that dissimilar to how things were done in other fields to govern or oversee bad or unwanted behaviors. But before we do that, let's talk about different types of crime prevention, and then we'll eventually get into showing how these sort of come together within the situational crime prevention, or SCP, framework. There are three types of crime prevention. The first one is called primary prevention, and that involves a number of different elements which are listed there. Let me go through each of them. Under environmental design, that's where we're talking about architectural aspects and design, as well as lighting and access control, very, very much deeply integrated into things like CPTED. Neighborhood watch, which includes citizen patrols or general surveillance. General deterrence is related to the arrest and conviction of people who are caught committing unwanted acts, and the methods of sentencing, like for example, there could be shame reintegration versus incarceration or what have you. Public education in terms of what is actually going on with respect to crime and crime prevention in a particular area. That's pretty important because in the absence of knowledge, people tend to fantasize or think what they think is accurate, and in talking with citizens in a law enforcement capacity, you frequently find that two things. One, there's a misunderstanding between the two parties in terms of what's going on and what the other is doing about it. Moreover, very frequently, the people who live in those neighborhoods really know the sort of rhythms and patterns of what's going on there, and can be an invaluable asset in terms of stopping those unwanted behaviors. Now again, I'm putting this in the context of traditional policing, but you can apply the same thinking outside of policing. Social crime prevention has to do with unemployment, poverty, job training, and economic infrastructure within an area. And then lastly, private security. Well, that has to do with private security. The two other types of crime prevention are secondary and tertiary. Under secondary, we have identification and prediction, which has to do with crime area analysis and early identification of problems and problem individuals. Situational crime prevention, which has to do with problem identification and situation-specific intervention, and that's what we're going to be spending quite a bit of time on. Community policing we're going to address in a few slides, so I'll get to that in a bit. With respect to substance abuse, well, that has to do with the fact that there's clearly a integral relationship between overall crime, especially violence, and drug use, whether it be between drug dealers or people who are looking to make money or what have you to make their next buy. And lastly, schools and crime prevention. That's fairly obvious. It basically has to do with the fact that most criminal acts are committed by juveniles to young adults, roughly mid-teens to mid-20s. So given that, it stands to reason that the better relations there are between the community and juveniles and opportunities for them to deflect themselves away from delinquent or criminal behavior, the better. Tertiary prevention has to do with different philosophies of punishment or philosophies of justice in terms of how society organizes itself to respond to the offender once they're caught and what are the long-term implications to recidivism. And these are truly our philosophical concepts, which are kind of outside the scope of what we're talking about here, but nonetheless are important to raise. For the next couple slides, we're going to talk about policing. And within the policing literature, situational crime prevention is called problem-oriented policing. And again, I know I haven't defined situational crime prevention yet. I'm going to do that in a few slides, but I want to give sort of a general context. Because if you think about the police as being society's sort of organized, formal response to report criminal acts, then whether we're talking about crimes as formal crimes or crimes as unwanted behaviors in informal settings, such as within an institution, a hospital, a lab, or whatever, we can think that we can relate that the traditional response to these things has been to respond after the fact and to come in and investigate and figure out what happened. Kind of like the Keystone Cops. Evidence on what makes really effective crime prevention, and again, from now on, whenever you hear us use the word crime prevention, think any behavior prevention. So anyway, evidence on what makes good crime prevention points to the vital role of crime analysis. And understanding that research can help you apply those lessons that have been learned over the last third of a century through research and what have you. And there's been considerable research into which police practices are effective at reducing crime and which practices are not effective. So I'm going to present a figure on the following screen, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time walking you through it. This figure shows 4 broadly different forms of crime prevention. Now, the least effective approach to crime reduction are in the lower left quadrant and the most effective are in the upper right. Now, again, where it says problem-oriented policing, in this week we're talking about situational crime prevention. Situational crime prevention, problem-oriented policing, as far as you're concerned, it is the same thing. In fact, it is the same thing, so that's convenient. In the lower left corner of the figure, we have the standard model of policing. This is the dominant policing strategy in North America. The standard model is characterized by its reliance on law enforcement and a lack of focus. Here we find general patrolling to deter offenders, rapid responses to a wide variety of calls for police service, follow-up investigations, and other law enforcement activities that make little distinction among the characteristics of the people, places, times, or situations. Faced with a public demand to reduce crime, public officials and the press who are wedded to the standard model will request more police officers, decrease in response times, greater police visibility, higher success rates in investigations, and more arrests. Equally important is what the press and public officials do not call for. Increased precision as to who, what, when, where, why, and how crimes take place. Distinctions among crime types. The involvement of other public and private institutions to address crime, or the application of non-law enforcement alternatives. Some of the earliest research into police effectiveness address aspects of the standard model. This research has consistently failed to find that the standard model has any noticeable effect on crime, disorder, or fear of crime. Random patrol, rapid response, follow-up investigations, and arrest policies may be very beneficial for other purposes, but we should not expect any of these practices to have an impact on crime or disorder. Nor is there solid evidence that adding police to carry out these practices will affect crime. To have an effect on crime, research strongly suggests that police strategies must include 2 elements. These are represented on the axes of the figure. First, the strategy must diversify its approaches to crime and disorder. That is, policing must address crime and disorder using a greater range of tools than simply enforcing the law. This idea is expressed on the vertical axis. There is evidence that working with the public and going beyond law enforcement can have modest crime and disorder reduction effects. And the more personal the police-citizen contacts, the more likely it is that they will have an effect on crime. The second element necessary to highly effective policing is focus. This element is expressed on the horizontal axis of the figure. There is generally solid evidence that geographically concentrated enforcement at crime or disorder hotspots can be effective, at least in the short run. That is, focused patrolling of very small high-crime places, such as street corners and block faces, has a modest effect on crime and a large effect on disorder. This can be accomplished with or without intensive arrest actions. If a few individuals are responsible for most crime or disorder, then removing them should reduce crime. Though sound in principle, the research testing this idea is very poor, so we do not know whether repeat offender programs work in actual practice, or if they have a seemingly promising notion that cannot effectively be carried out. Problem-oriented policing applies both elements, combining the use of diverse approaches with focused action. How effective is it? Well, we'll revisit that question in a later presentation in this week. For now, we're going to go into sort of defining what it is and then looking at how it works and sort of the context to previous theoretical concepts that we've learned thus far and adding a few more. Once again, in case I was vague or ambiguous before, remember, when we talk about situational crime prevention, or sometimes when we refer to it as problem-oriented policing, we're thinking of it as situational blank prevention. Matter of fact, maybe we can combine the two and call it situational problem prevention. Either way, whatever you put fill in the blank, the point is that the technique that we're going to be illustrating for you this week is, we believe, an effective tool for preventing or controlling unwanted behaviors in a specific environment. So let's define it a little more clearly. Situational crime prevention involves primary crime prevention directed at specific problems, places, persons, or crimes, as opposed to making broad changes in an entire community or neighborhood, which is much closer to SEPTED. Situational crime prevention also encompasses elements of secondary crime prevention in identifying existing crime problems at the micro level and applying interventions, such as physical design changes, improving surveillance, altering social behaviors, etc. Situational crime prevention can thus be used to keep crime problems or criminal activity from arising in the first place, which is the primary crime prevention element, or it can be used to attempt to remedy or control crime problems already in existence, which would be a secondary level of crime prevention. The early roots of situational crime prevention are really traced back to the work of the British Home Office. The British Home Office in England is sort of a combination of our Department of Interior and Department of Justice put into one department, so it's a very powerful entity in Britain. Anyway, during the 1970s, Clark and many of his other colleagues conducted a number of research projects focusing on reducing different crimes in specific places and contexts. And additionally, their work and research grew out of the recognition that crime often reflects the risk, effort, and payoff assessed by the offenders themselves. One thing that we really want to make sure we get across is and which is why we bolded it, is the word specific. Situational crime prevention, it ultimately, on one hand, is about the specific identifying of behaviors and what have you in specific locations. So I want to illustrate that in a few different ways, so let's take a look. Some researchers have argued that preventing residential burglaries targeted on electronic goods requires quite different measures from those to prevent burglaries targeted on cash or jewelry. This is because they found many differences between these two sorts of burglaries in the cities that they studied. When the targets were cash or jewelry, burglaries occurred mostly in older homes near to the downtown area and were apparently committed by offenders on foot, such as the apartment on the right. When the targets were electronic goods such as TVs and VCRs, the burglaries generally took place in newer, more distant suburbs and were committed by offenders with cars. The cars were needed to transport the stolen goods and had to be parked near to the house, but not so close as to attract attention, such as the neighborhood on the left. The layout of housing in the newer suburbs allowed these conditions to be met, and the researchers' preventive suggestions consisted principally of means to counter the lack of natural surveillance of parking places and roadways. Their suggestion to prevent inner-city burglaries focused on improving security and surveillance at the point of entry. Matter of fact, you might recall from last week when we had a presentation on SEPTED where we showed an aerial sort of illustration of your typical suburban plot where it is very much oriented towards cars and diminishes the amount of natural surveillance, that the amounts of eyes and what have you that people will see on somebody. This slide is meant to illustrate how we can look at different kinds of problems but find common solutions. In other words, vandalism to elevators, theft from cars, what have you, these are very different kinds of crime problems. But when looked at as a holistic whole, when looked at holistically, it's possible to find common characteristics of what is most likely to prevent those crimes and find an economy of scale. One of the things you're going to find as we move forward with the situational crime prevention is that it specifies a particular approach to researching your problems and identifying these kinds of tangents. So, for example, specific problems in a dilapidated neighborhood or apartment complex should always be separately analyzed, such as the ones below. But, for cost-effectiveness reasons, solutions ought to be considered together. In the hypothetical example provided on the screen, the last identified solution, a gatekeeper and closed-circuit television system, is the most costly of all those listed, but is also predicted to be the most cost-effective for each problem. It might therefore be chosen as a solution to all three problems when costs might have been ruled out for just one of the problems. So in other words, we're looking at the problems as a holistic. In other words, we're looking at the overall interlinkages of the problems as well as the solutions. And that is ultimately what where we're headed. In short, situational crime prevention focuses on the individual crimes and not the desires to commit crimes, as we'll see once in the next presentation when we show the interlinkages with previous theoretical frameworks we've looked at, such as routine activities. We just assume everybody is a likely offender, depending on the particular events and opportunities present in an environment. And therefore, situational crime prevention, like routine activities, focus on the near immediate opportunities in an environment, not the distant causes, the fuzzy root causes, as you see in many criminality theories. So all these elements that you see on the screen, I think will be, if they haven't emerged already from the readings, will emerge out of some of the things we're going to be looking at as we move forward. So we're going to throw a couple more things at you in the next couple of presentations. The very next one looks at some of the theoretical frameworks that give context to situational crime prevention. We're going to reintroduce you to a few that we've already seen, add a few more, and then move on. In the third and fourth presentations, which we might combine into one, so if you don't see a fourth, it's because we combined them. But we're going to look at how situational crime prevention is practiced in terms of the method. It's sort of a combination of research methods and analysis. And then we're going to look at some case studies and how it's been used effectively.